There it is. Share. Slide. Okay, we'll start off with a little quiz here. Um, this picture was sent to me by Ramsey. Um, that's your clue. Anybody know why Ramsey would send me this picture?
The young Nancy
Um,
Pelosi.
And this is Nancy Pelosi, yes.
Very good. And there she is with JFK, and there she is running for Congress. So I thought that was a little blast from the past, a little nostalgia to get us started on this sorry problem. The other inspirational thing I found, which we all need, was Jason Carter's tribute to his grandfather. And he talked about how he loved his neighbor as himself. And the example he gave was the community action that he took to eliminate the guinea worm in Africa, and which he essentially did. And his grandson said he saw tiny 600-person villages that everybody thinks is impoverished. He recognized the strengths that they have because he was from a little village like that. And he felt that he could figure out how to go into partnership with these villages and love them as he loved his neighbors in Plains. And so the grandson says he essentially eradicated a disease with love and respect. That was my inspirational thing for the week before we get to this sad disaster that we're living through. Um, I'll start off by showing this year's family Christmas card, which we took 2 weeks before this place was charred beyond recognition. Um, there were no improvements on this piece of land. Our son Jeremy bought it on a lark when there's no running water. He just wanted a nice, quiet place overlooking Malibu to go and retreat. And this is what he had built, which is no more. So. Um, that was our family link, and his little piece of property was right here um, in the Palisades fire. Um, Homer sent an article that I would recommend. It's by Stephen Schmidt. It's available on his Substack. And it's titled The Warming. And so I thought I'd just kind of go through it because it's a very sobering essay, and he makes a lot of good points. Um, and he compares it to the Great Fire of London in 1666, and states that this fire that we're living through is going to be recalled 500 years from now. He called it biblical, and it joins the big fires in Chicago and San Francisco. This is the Ferry Building. After the earthquake, the fires came in and finished off the city, destroying 80% of buildings. And we're kind of wondering when the next big one was going to come, but it wasn't an earthquake. It was the January winds blowing onto drought-stricken land that did it. And he said it's comparable to our firebombing of Tokyo in World War II. That was a sobering statement. And he points out that it was predictable, and in fact, it was destiny. And in a way, it's kind of an Armageddon, a brutal judgment built on our arrogance for building in this beautiful place where we live, the Garden of Eden, which has tempted us. And actually, to put it in a larger perspective, and this is the kind of map that Pepper sends me periodically, fires aren't just a California problem. They've been a huge problem up in Canada. And we just got to keep that perspective. We're not being singled out here. Global warming is equal opportunity destroyer. And he likened it to the Titanic. It involved the same kind of hubris. And like that, the lessons are enduring. Yeah, Bob.
Oh, I don't know if some of you saw um, the paragraph written by Joan Didion, which has been moving around the last few days. In 1969, Joan Didion wrote in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, she wrote, Los Angeles weather is the weather of catastrophe, of apocalypse. And just as the reliably long and bitter winters of New England determine the way life is lived there, so the violence and the unpredictability of the Santa Ana affect the entire quality of life in Los Angeles, accentuate its impermanence, its unreliability. The winds show us how close to the edge we are. Written 56 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm going to go over what we knew and when we knew it. So yeah, 1960s. Thanks, Bob. Are we going to take lessons from this like we took from the Titanic? And he makes it clear that, and I think this is the sentiment we've all heard. We love California. And we can remember when we first set foot here, those of us that are later comers, and there's no place in the world like it. And we're all here. We wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But we have to come to terms with the deadly aspect of the beauty, what we're risking. And the other point is California is people can look down their nose, but there's no way America succeeds without California. And as we know, the fifth leading economy in the world, and it has its own mythology that writers talk about, including Joan Didion. Um, but it is a complex state and a complex nation, maybe the most complex in the history of the world, according to Schmidt. Um, and so that's a challenge. Um, he also points out, he's a Republican, that it's had one party rule, and that party is going to have to stand up and take responsibility. Yeah, Harold.
I'm going to have to leave in a little bit. I just wanted to let you know that I used to live in Altadena, which is
Oh,
now looking kind of like Tokyo after the World War II. And the
wow.
house I used to live in back in the late 50s is toast. My old junior high school is toast. And what used to be downtown Altadena is pretty much mostly toast.
Huh.
So,
Huh.
Wow.
Is that
and
where the Will
the first year we
Rogers
lived there, we
ranch?
found out about the Santa Ana winds because it blew off part of our roof.
Oh,
brand new house and it blew off part of the roof.
wow. Wow. Is that where the Will Rogers Ranch was?
Uh, I'm not
No,
sure.
Will
No,
Rogers Ranch is off of Sunset, very on the way to Palisades. We used to live very close to there, to the Palisades,
The
back in
other
the
thing
80s.
Claremont used to be famous for is back in the 20s, they built a cog railway from what was basically the top of Lake, with top of Altadena, all the way up to Mount Lowell. And there used to be a resort up there, and people used to go drive up there to the end of the road and take the cog railway up to the mountain and observe the LA basin and look out and see Catalina from the top of the mountain. But that got torn down after the Depression. They recycled all the rails and there's not much left of it.
raise the
Wow.
volume.
Wow.
Raise the volume, please. We can't hear because we're
So
doing.
I have to leave to go get chicken feed, so that's why I kind of threw this in at this time. I'm done. Thanks.
Um, okay. We've got a little problem here in the studio. Hold on just a second.
Well, while we're holding on, about California being the fifth largest economy in the world, on a per capita basis, California is ahead of the four above us. We are the most productive state of country in the world of GDP per capita. Per capita.
Right. 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 So, is our one party state going to respond to this? And Schmidt predicts it'll upend a lot of stuff, and we can't wish it away. And he wonders if the initiative and referendum process um, will be helpful or whether it will be abused by political profiteers. And when we get to the history of California, we'll learn that this initiative and referendum process was pioneered by the Los Angeles City Council in 1902. So this is a long California tradition, and is it going to help this time or not? And will the insurance companies deny claims, saying it was a wind event, not a fire event? And how about the state insurance? And how about the inability to get insurance after this? And so we'll see. We'll see. The metaphor that is offered, I'm offering, that it's so beautiful here that we'll build anywhere. So when all the ships came in for the gold rush, the they were abandoned. And as many of us know, the were eventually covered with landfill and built upon them, and that's the Marina District. And it's why during an earthquake, the Marina District is most at risk. So I thought this was an interesting metaphor I'd offer. The lengths that we've gone to. We've recovered from the 1906 quake. We by the end of World War One, we had solved the water problem, particularly in L.A., which gets its water from the Owens Valley, not from the Delta, as some politicians are wrongly asserting. And there were 3.4 million people here. That tripled by the end of World War II. Being on the Pacific, this is where a lot of the aerospace industry settled. And then with the communications revolution at the turn of the century, it's 34 million people, and now it's 40, making us larger than most countries. And we see that the majority of growth has taken place in Southern California. Um, of course, mainly Los Angeles County, which itself I think has over 10 million. Um, so um, Schmidt asserts that the cleanup is going to be larger than the cost of cleanup for 9/11. And what we're dealing with is toxic and cancerous debris. Um, uh, and he asserts it's going to be the most expensive disaster in the history of the United States. So he kind of grabs a hold of us and it gets our attention and doesn't let go by asserting one thing after another. Many will not rebuild and probably shouldn't. This is LA from space. The long history of other big urban fires. I thought I'd go through that just to get us some perspective. These other great urban fires have shaped urban development and molded fire safety laws and emergency response protocols. So the first really big one was the Great New York City fire in 1836. And what came back, they built back better, realizing that they would need subways to survive in New York City. Similarly, the Great Chicago Fire, that was the one where Mrs. Murphy had a cow who kicked over a lantern. They built back better with steel and steel skyscrapers. I wasn't familiar with this fire, so let me just tell you what that's all about. But there was a Boston fire and a Seattle fire, similarly. This Peshtigo fire was a real wildfire that took place on both sides of Lake Michigan, and killed 2,000 people. You can't understand how that would happen. Now we get into familiar territory. Again, the San Francisco earthquake and a fire that destroyed 80% of the city and killed as many as 5,000 people. Think of that. There is Baltimore, more famous in the history of labor politics was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where young women had been locked into the 20th floor of a building in New York, and when fire broke out, they couldn't get out, and they famously leapt from windows when the heat became overwhelming. Killed 146 women and led to significant reform in the workplace. Nightclub fire, and then the second great Chicago fire in 1958. It was focused really on a school near a warehouse, and 92 students died. In the 21st century, we get in real familiar territory. We all remember what we were doing the day the Oakland Hills caught fire. And I sure remember that Sunday morning going to get the newspaper and just feeling the warm wind. What's going on? And that was an omen. 3,000 homes. We all know somebody who lost a home and killed 25 people. Another nightclub fire, and then back to California, Paradise, the deadliest wildfire. So this isn't an urban fire. This was a wildfire that hit a retirement community, and we know somebody whose parents were there. 83, 85 deaths, but 18,000 structures. And then right up where we go for Shakespeare in Ashland, there was a big fire in 2020. And we remember when we went up to Ashland a number of years, we would have to wear masks because of the forest fires around Ashland. And this one took out a nearby town in 2020. So, why is this happening so often in California? And I'd just like to run through some reasons. It's been an integral part of California, and for those of us that have been doing the history, and we covered the Native American California, we remember what their mastery of fire. They worked with fire, and they've been doing it for centuries and centuries. We know from paleological evidence, charcoal deposits in settlements. We know of pollen and fossil records, the species that have adapted to our fire-prone environment. The second level of evidence is the ecosystems, the fire-resistant, resilient vegetation. Chaparral, you saw chaparral in that picture of I showed of the family Christmas photo. Sequoia trees have a fire-resistant bark, which may be a product of evolution. And we know sequoia and other plants, fires help release seeds. Grasslands actually benefit from burns. And the Native Americans knew this and did planned burns, small controlled burns. I did not know that manzanita requires a fire to germinate their seeds. So they're very much dependent on that for their life cycle. Another bit of evidence is what we know anthropologically from the Miwok and the Yurok and other tribes about the controlled burns. They describe what they do and why. And that it actually promotes the key staple of Native Americans which is acorns and of course berries and other grasses. And the logic behind controlled burns is it reduces the risk of a larger, more uncontrolled burn. And we might mention whether there'd been controlled burns in Southern California. I'm sure that we'll be finding that out. One objection to controlled burns is that quite often the new growth is an invasive plant from plants that have been imported into California. So the other bit of archaeological evidence is the burned artifacts that are apparent in villages that existed long before Europeans came. And the interesting thing that if you look at what are the cycles of these fires and natural fire cycles, and it turns out they've been every 5 to 20 years. And the other bits of evidence for that are tree rings that show how often these natural fires take place. So every 5 to 20 years, there's a natural fire cycle, independent of controlled burns by Native Americans. The other thing to point out is what drives those cycles, and it's our Mediterranean climate. There's only 5 Mediterranean climates in the whole world, and we're lucky enough to live in one. But the risk is the cycle involves drying out during the summer months in between the rainfall cycles. And you also, for a fire, need ignition. And the Native Americans, it was lightning. But now there's plenty of other sources of ignition. And the sixth is the impact on biodiversity, that regular fires prevent the dominance of any single plant species that would squeeze out the blossoming of any new plants. And fire has helped maintain this balance in the ecosystems. The ecological benefits clearly are getting rid of dead vegetation and releasing nutrients and creating openings for new growth. So that's the environment in which we're getting these cyclical fires. But now add in one more element, which Native Americans didn't have to deal with over the centuries, and that's global warming. And we've known about global warming at least since the 1970s. And there's something called the precautionary principle that ecologists talk about. Even in the absence of smoking gun, if you have something that could cause disastrous consequences, maybe it would be a good idea to err on the side of precaution. And that's the opportunity that we had in the 1970s, which we ignored. And you'd think that conservatives would be the people that would be championing a precautious approach to problems. But that's not the way it was. And I first saw this cartoon, and I said, "Woo, that's harsh." Big oil and the GOP. I couldn't have done it without you. But as I think back on it and research this rings true now. Who's accountable for this? And it's certainly more the Republicans than the Democrats, and I think I'll tell you why. So one little bit of nuance per chat GPT. The Santa Ana winds are not directly caused by global warming. So I think we have to get our definition straight as the finger pointing starts. So we have to concede that's not the case. What's happening is the environment they're blowing into, maybe at the same rate that they used to blow into, are more dangerous. And I'll tell you why. First of all, the Santa Ana winds. This would be a map like Pepper would send me periodically, but the Santa Ana winds come from the Great Basin, involving changes of pressure. But there was a sudden shift from January 6th to January 8th, and you can see all this kind of chaotic winds. The Santa Ana winds usually blow from October. That's when the big Oakland fire was, through December, and usually tapering off. And usually by then we've had some rain, but not this year, not in Southern California. They haven't had any rain. So these late Santa Ana winds are blowing into a very dry area. And in addition to the dried out vegetation, we're in a drought. And Pepper has taught me that we're in the middle of a mega drought, and I'll show you a graph of that in just a second. So we're more vulnerable. The fire season is extended more, lack of rain. And so, in summary, the combination of drier landscapes, the strong winds blow onto a natural tinder. The Palisades fire kind of burned out as it headed northwest, because there'd been a previous fire in 2018, the Woolsey fire. And this should have been a wake-up call for the people living in this area. And so it was helpful in a way that the previous fire, kept this fire from continuing. And hopefully this fire will preclude any follow-on fires for a while. But this mega drought, here is a map of droughts over the last 12 centuries. And it's helpful to see that it used to be even drier, but we may be entering a mega drought, which started around 2000. And so this might be something that's going to be longer lasting. Just for a larger context, the Horn of Africa and the Mediterranean itself are having droughts. And what is the link between global warming and droughts? Studies estimate that global warming accounts for 40% of the drought. So it's even more likely now with global warming.
Hey, John. Just
Yes.
a couple things. One, this Santa Ana was pretty unusual in that the speed of the winds. So one of the things we know about climate change is there's more energy in the atmosphere. So these winds, Santa Ana's are typically 60, 70, maybe 80. This thing was closer to 100 miles an hour. And the other thing that's important to remember is that Great Basin is almost 5,000 feet high. So as that blob moves down to the west, it drops in elevation, which increases its energy and increases its temperature. So that's why you get those really warm winds that you mentioned about Oakland. It's the descent and the compression of the air. Anyway, small parts, but
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Um, so, who's accountable? Who ignored what we knew by 1970s? And this is 2015 on the floor of the Senate, and Imhoff was the chairman of the Environment Committee, and it's there was an early snow, and he mocked the concern for global warming. So uh, I think that this cartoon is justified. So temperature over the past 50 years, as we know, it's going up and up. This maps out exactly how much. And interestingly, the Arctic has warmed the most. Um, the land has warmed more than the oceans. That's because the oceans had a natural buffering from its depth, but those buffers aren't working as well anymore. Um, the measure and we can estimate what the cycles of temperature were in the past from tree rings. But now, since the 1880s, we have pretty accurate direct measurements of temperature. And it's, as we know, rising, rising, rising. So the evidence has been there. Um, there's always a talk, well, there's a natural variability, and there is. And there are other things that contribute to global warming, like volcanoes, sure. But now you can tease out the human forces which are responsible for the majority of the rise. Um, Tipping points. There's been Greenland's been a lot in the news, and there is a tipping point. The ice sheet. We've seen that there's been some tipping point reached in the Antarctic as well. And this is a color code for how soon different parts of the world are going to reach tipping points. Um, and one tipping point is the thawing of the permafrost, which does a lot. There's a positive feedback loop, but part of this is the release of methane, which is even more of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So positive feedback loop. Desertification, part of the problem of migrants going into Europe and getting on boats and risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean to Italy and Spain. Part of that is that their villages have become uninhabitable in sub-Saharan Africa, or Saharan Africa for that matter. Rising sea levels. This is Venice now, and Venice has an even bigger problem because they have been like Southern Great Valley. they've been pumping groundwater from under Venice. So, in addition to the sea rising, Venice is sinking. Um, so, current emissions, coal, most of that's being burnt in China. And we can say tisk, tisk. But when you look at per capita fossil CO2 emissions, United States per capita is responsible. So the problem is with you and me, in terms of urgency and who can do what. Um, the head in the sand for 100 years. I'm going to make my case why that I think that's true. I mean, even now, the public underestimates the actual scientific consensus on global warming, underestimates it by a lot. Oh, they're not sure. We'll see. That's not the case. So here is an early article that succinctly described the greenhouse effect. And the famous scientists early on that were associated with recognizing that. So that's over 100 years ago. Um, uh, to bolster the argument, there's data from the ocean, and there's a famous scientist, a couple of them at Scripps, and they pointed out the oceans could only absorb so much CO2, and pretty soon it's going to start accumulating in the atmosphere at a higher and higher rates. Al Gore, he's a hero in all this. And as early as the 1880s, he had contacted this guy, Ravel. Another guy, and he did a lot of his work at a place where we were recently on the Big Island, Mauna Loa Observatory. He measured the rising atmosphere of CO2, creating something called the Keeling curve. So we've known about this. Here's a guy who coined the term global warming. That's been around since 1975. And he predicted that CO2 would cause a lot of damage. He came up with the theory of the great ocean conveyor belt, how warm water circulates, and then back into cold and warm, and what this implied for the oceans and the atmosphere. So Gore, to his credit, he initiated the first congressional hearings on climate change in 1981. So he's been there the whole time. And he ran for president. And this was one of his campaign platforms, global warming. And then a NASA scientist with a lot of credibility delivered testimony to the U.S. Congress in 1988. It wasn't just Al Gore and some of his science buddies. This guy took it mainstream in 1988 and increased the awareness of the public. Gore amplified Hanson's message in a book You'll remember he wrote another one, Inconvenient Truths. We'll get to that. But before that, in 1992 book, uh, probably prepared as part of his run for the presidency, but it fell on deaf ears. Um, then aside from what's going on in America, what's going on in the world? 1972, there's a conference in Stockholm sponsored by the UN. So they're doing their job. And then they commissioned a report done by an MIT scientist talking about global warming. Um, so maybe we remember this. Now we reach something I think we all remember and live through, and that was the so-called Kyoto Protocol. Clinton's in the White House. Gore is the vice president. And so he gets on the world stage and becomes part of the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first major international treaty. Um, and they looked at where can we do the most, the quickest, and they looked at 36 developed countries. You all can afford it. You're emitting a lot of CO2. Why don't you guys go first? And the goal was to reduce emissions to at least 5% below the 1990 levels. So we're going back 7 years to see if we can turn the clock back. But did the U.S. Senate ratify the treaty? No, they did not. So Gore is kind of a solitary figure, but he has become a global leader.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Just one thing, there's a number of us who are physicians, but I've often likened the planet to a human being because people understand that a little more. But if you told somebody their child had a 2-degree Celsius fever and that their blood gases had changed 0.07, in other words, they were no longer at 7.4, they were at 7.33 in acidosis, any pulmonologist, any of us would clearly understand the implications of what that means if we're moving in that direction. So you didn't mention that, but I think those are important pieces. And if for the non-physicians, it just, we'd be very concerned about those perturbations in the homeostasis of a person, let alone the planet as a whole.
Yes. And so varied is our group that we do have a pulmonologist. So,
I know. There you go. Well, I'm sure Homer can elaborate further, but
so then in 2006, Al Gore writes his book, gives his presentation, and wins an Academy Award for the film version. And the next year, he gets the Nobel Peace Prize. This is an American that gets the Nobel Peace Prize. The United States and China should make the boldest moves. We're accountable before history. And I urge President Bush to change because Bush wasn't on board with any of this, being a typical Republican. So, what did Bush know and when did he know it? Bush, when he takes office in 2001, withdraws us from the Kyoto Treaty. So, setting the precedent of Republicans taking giant step backwards when they come in to office. Was that his Texan oil background? His vice president, Dick Cheney, had been working for an energy outfit, Halliburton, and he put together a task force with petroleum company executives, and no doubt this has had something to do with why Bush would take us out of a treaty that 174 nations had ratified. So I love this quote. I'll let you read it. So this gets us back to California. Who is Upton Sinclair? He's the Democratic candidate for governor in 1934. And he was the most radical candidate running for governor. Remember, this is during the Depression. And he'd already written a book called Oil. And it's based on the oil that was discovered in Southern California, the part of the state that is now suffering the most from global warming. It was a bestseller. He was a muckraker and got out on the street and sold his book. He had also written books on the scandal of meat packing, unsanitary, causing the Pure Food and Drug Act to come into being. He had also come up with a Social Security plan long before FDR, but California businesses ignored it. Upton Sinclair is not to be confused with Sinclair Lewis, who wrote this book, It Can't Happen Here. It can, and it has twice. What I want to point out, and this is interesting from the standpoint of history, is LA was one of the epicenters of oil discovery. There's this guy, Edward Doheny. If you go to LA, you'll run across Doheny Street. He was curious about the tar seeps, think the La Brea tar pits, that he saw near Echo Park. And so on weekends and nights, he started digging a well. And lo and behold, he hit oil in 1892, which really set off the petroleum boom in Southern California. There'd already been some oil discoveries. Here's the La Brea tar pits. There's a museum there that features the prehistoric animals that were trapped in the tar pits, and so those remains are the focus part of the museum. If you haven't been, so Doheny dug his well at this intersection, and it wasn't the first time that oil had been discovered. Up in Humboldt, much earlier, 30 years earlier, oil had been discovered, and there's actually a town up there called Petrolia. If you've been driving, we've been past Petrolia when we were up there. And that's from an early discovery. There's this movie, There Will Be Blood, which is about, it got an Academy Award about the discovery of oil and what it does to an adventurer played by Daniel Day-Lewis in the Central Valley. And there was another oil strike in Pico Canyon, which is all part of the bigger LA oil basin. So this is in the Santa Susana Mountains. I'll show you where that is on a map. They had a gusher, and it's not that far from where Doheny discovered his oil. So we're dealing with a larger Los Angeles oil field, and you can still see evidence of it when you're driving by the freeway. Sometimes you see these little derricks that are just pumping away. So it's still active. And so this is LA after Doheny struck oil. All these derricks were put up in everybody's backyard, just pumping money out of the ground. This is quite amazing. And so there's a reason why LA is centered around the automobile and the car. And unfortunately, that meant that all the mass transit that had been built, the railway system, the streetcars, the Red Line, sadly, all that got pulled up. Think about how nice it would be to have that now, all for the love affair with the car. And I'm guilty as much as anybody else. I can remember when I turned 16 and the sense of liberation I had driving our family car away from the house. So I think I'm almost out of time here. This might be,
305.
yeah, this might be a good place to stop when we talk about where California oil fits in with the rest of the world. So I'll stop talking and let you all talk if you want to.
I just wanted to,
You're muted.
no, I'm not.
Oh.
Introduce our friend. Are you
Oh.
hearing me?
Yeah. Hi.
Hello there, Ron McDougall. I enjoyed your presentation.
Well, thank you. Welcome.
Unfortunately, I remember much of it. He lived in Southern California. Yeah. Well, I
Oh,
lived there too for a while.
well, there you go.
Oil derricks, yeah, they'd be Signal Hill.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Joan, you could have closed the loop since you opened with Jimmy Carter. He actually called attention to climate change in his presidency and instituted measures in the White House to reduce its electricity consumption and advocated for it on a national level.
He put solar panels on the White House roof.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. So, I mean, he was pre-Al Gore as a political leader. And of course, you can't help but think of our Supreme Court, and especially Sandra Day O'Connor's vote giving the presidency to George Bush instead of to Al Gore. The consequences of that intervention are lingering with us. Just a couple of other things. You were right about the ethnicity, but wrong on the name. It was Catherine O'Leary's cow that kicked over the lantern that supposedly started the Chicago fire, not Murphy. O'Leary.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And when you get to the issue of rebuilding, there was a big fire 30 years ago in Santa Rosa's richest neighborhood, Fountain Grove. And rebuilding there, very expensive homes burned to the ground, was forbidden, but one form of political corruption or shenanigans after another led to its rebuilding, to it being burned down again with a fire that followed almost the identical route from Calistoga over to Santa Rosa to burn Fountain Grove a second time. It's now fully rebuilt. This is not a lesson we're going to learn easily.
Oh, no. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. In fact, Ginny just gave me a note. Solar panels. George Bush took the solar panels that Carter had installed off the White House.
Ronald Reagan did.
Ronald Reagan.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I would just say in his defense, not that I'm trying to defend him really, the White House was under repair, the roof, I mean. So the panels, which were not solar photovoltaic, they were passive water heating panels like we have for our pools. Some people do anyway. I don't. And so they had probably seen the best of their times, if only up there for a few years. But yes, Reagan could have put photovoltaics up on the roof. They did exist. They've existed since 1950 something.
Really? Huh. Okay.
Can I ask the greater question, which is what's happening and what's going to happen going forward? I mean, we have a new president coming in who talks about drill, baby, drill, and so on. Are we going to see a return to the GOP's embrace of oil companies and so forth, and the idea that the science doesn't count and so on? I mean, that's what I'm really worried about.
I think the answer to that is yes.
Well, and there may also be legal moves against the oil companies, much like the tobacco companies were held liable. There have been some cases by children around the world and other people's.
In Montana, they did.
Montana, yeah, there've been a number. So that sense, the insurers and the CIA famously, I think in the 80s or 90s, talked about climate change as a destabilizing force around the planet.
I'm sure under Tulsi Gabbard's leadership, they're going to come out strong for that.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael, we do history here. And I really try to stay away from speculation over breaking stories. Every once in a while, you just can't resist. And I agree. But I think as we watch what's going to happen, we should just keep the history in mind.
Well, historically, didn't Donald Trump say that climate change the theory is a Chinese plot?
I thought he said it was a hoax.
Oh, hoax. Okay, better than plot. Chinese hoax.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. I remember the international meeting where Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton went in and kind of steamrolled a forward-looking. Did anybody else remember that? So I'm going to give him and Hillary some credit. Yeah. For the good old days. What if Hillary had won the first time?
Well, speaking of history, then what about? I mean, you could do a retro, as it were, on what's been accomplished under Biden. I mean, he's done a heck of a lot. Janine just told me he's giving some kind of farewell address. Was it Wednesday night? Tomorrow night. Biden's giving a farewell address, and he may speak about his efforts on climate change.
Yeah.
And he got through a lot of good legislation, right?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He's incentivized the natural sources of energy. So,
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, John.
See you next week.
Thank you, John.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
John. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.